Benjamin Castle are Americans. Watching the footy.
Liam Ryan saying, kick it my way, I want to jump over the pack, and here he comes! Ryan!
This is Buddy Franklin! This is the greatest showman!
Got the handball off to Myers. Myers looking for the lead of Stengel. Gee, they're good. Gee, they're sharp.
Oh, who else? McDonald!
From inside the centre square, Boyd kick the goal. Boyd kick the goal. From inside the centre. Fuck! I can't believe
that. Good time of day to you, everyone. This is Americans Watching the Footy. This is part 2 of our 2023 season preview, also known as episode 77. My name's Ethan Castle.
I am Benjamin Castle. Yes, this is the 5th episode of our 2nd season already.
And it's kind of fitting that we're recording right now after Australia's 8-7 win over South Korea at the World Baseball Classic.
Did I see something about a player getting tagged out while pimping a double?
I was not watching that part of the game, but nonetheless, great win. Let's consider that this is not as strong as some of the past Australian teams. I mean, you look at the roster and there's like 2 guys that have played in Major League Baseball in the last decade for more than like a couple games, to the point that I remember them, those being Aaron Whitefield, who I believe is a Brisbane Lions fan, and Warwick Saupold, who, let's see.
Judging from his Twitter history, I believe he's a Dockers fan. Seen multiple old tweets of his with hashtag Purple Army at the end. Games they played in old finals campaigns. Aha. Being a Dockers supporter is an absolute roller coaster, he said in August of 2019. I can understand that one.
All right, I think that would kind of count as confirmation then.
Yeah.
Yeah, ooh, and he's also got some, he seems to be a legit footy fan. He was talking with the Daily Traders. He's really into it. All right. I am officially more of a Warwick Saupold fan now, and I hope one day we can have him on as a guest.
Between him and Travis Blackley, we got to start working our baseball connections, especially if Essendon shits down their leg again this year. But we already talked about Essendon last time, along with 5 other teams. We'll do 6 more in this episode and 6 in the next.
So, Warwick, if you're listening, there's a 50% chance we'll be talking about the Dockers.
Yeah, they haven't shown up yet. And as we get started here, wouldn't you know it, it's not the Dockers, it's their neighbors. Or co-tenants, I guess.
All right, well, Benjamin, you are the resident Eagles supporter and now member.
Exactly, yeah.
Don't think your first year as an Eagles member is going to go quite as well as my first year as a Cats member, but take it away.
I mean, it's pretty much impossible. The full rebuild has really yet to begin. I'm glad that they've drafted the way they have because they really focused on local West Australian talent at the top of things between Reuben Ginbey and Elijah Hewitt. And especially for a non-Victorian team, that's really necessary when you're rebuilding to prioritize the local talent because they're more likely to stick around and not leave you for a contender when things are going rough. They're going to want to more likely see it through closer to home.
And just going by the sheer numbers and population, you're more likely to benefit from that than South Australia, just considering you've got not quite 50% more people, but somewhere in the 30 to 40% range without actually crunching the numbers here. So I'm just comparing Western Australia to South Australia as footy states because it would be hard to compare with like New South Wales and Queensland.
Yeah, I mean, those places have the academies for a reason. And it's even tougher to find that sort of talent in rugby country. And props to the Lions and Swans for doing what they have been able to do with retaining some of that local talent. Speaking of Ginbey, I like what I saw from him against Adelaide in their second preseason match. Only had 17 touches, but 7 clearances from them. And I think that presence at the start of plays all across the ground means that he's a real contender for round 1. I hope he gets in. I want to see the young guys early and often this year. And like I've said with other rebuilding teams like Hawthorn in particular, I want to see the young guys tried out in different spots throughout the year. And then maybe toward the end of the season, Adam Simpson will really zone in on the couple different spots for players that might work out better than others, where players lie within that younger group. Certain groups of players have better chemistry. And there are definitely some players with some versatility that are on the list. My sleeper is one of them, and I'll get to them in a bit. But we saw, for example, Jermaine Jones get a bit more life once he was moved back. Rhett Bazzo can flex it between a couple positions, and Bazzo's had a rough time this summer, losing his mother in the boating accident. So hopefully he'll be able to come back into things soon. And we might really be seeing some of those younger guys right away, though, because it took long enough, but the injury bug has definitely started to hit. I'm listing how many different players in the report right now. 8, I believe. So Jack Petrocelli and Harry Barnett, picked 23 from this past draft, might be ready for round 1. They've both got ankle injuries, as does Jack Darling. We don't know about his timeline. The Eagles have just been unclear in general as to who's ready and who isn't. Maybe it's because they have a little bit more time to figure out things before next weekend, or maybe it's just because they're holding their cards close to their chest. But Darling, Luke Edwards has a quad injury. Nick Natanui with an Achilles tendon problem again. It's been a recurring thing for him. Luke Shuey, we don't exactly know what it is, but just Luke Shuey. And 2 Williams is Bailey with the hamstring. So that means that Callum Jamieson is probably going to be the first-rate ruck at this point. And I don't know, maybe Josh Rotham will have time in that second spot if we expect Nick Knapp to be out as well. Bailey Williams as well as Jack Williams, who had probably the most freakish injury of summer training with the ruptured spleen. Again, we haven't received reports on who's officially out for round 1. I'm happy that Darling has had a more complete summer program, though, because it was by his choice that he didn't last year.
Yeah, from my outsider, not only outsider, but probably watched less of the Eagles than any other team last year perspective.
Even more than the Giants?
Yeah, considering the way we split up games.
Yeah, I mean, we always prioritized watching our own teams when there were overlaps.
Yeah, so the name, obviously, that stands out to me out of this then is Natanui, because he's super fun to watch.
Still very effective in the pure ruck contest itself. His importance outside of those contests has further and further diminished, sadly, and I'm not sure how much time he has left in him.
I just want to see him go up against Sam Draper, which, spoiler alert to something we'll talk about later, there will be potential for that to happen twice. The very little Eagles content I have taken in, it does seem like Josh Rotham seems to be viewed pretty favorably within the club right now, so I would think he's one of those guys where even if injuries don't open up opportunities for him, there are going to be opportunities at some point because he's going to force his way in.
And at only 25, he's got plenty of time to make a good impression again. I see a lot of people thinking that the Eagles can make this huge leap upward this year, and maybe it's because I've watched them so much that I've begun to really scrutinize them, but one, I'm not sure if Adam Simpson has it in him to be able to take this group that far, and secondly, I think the younger side of the list needs another year or two to develop before they can really make that next step. That's why I'm thinking this year really needs to be a trial run for a lot of different players in different spots.
I mean, who on that younger side of the list do you really see as, possible cornerstones in a contending window?
I think both of our sleepers qualify, even though yours isn't really much of a sleeper.
Yeah, I'm calling Jai Coley my sleeper because A, he has dreads, and B, there just isn't much else on this list that really jumps out to me. I mean, I wouldn't count Jaden Hunt. I think he's one of the more well-established guys. He is certainly a nice pickup that'll help the defense.
I mean, we saw what Hunt could provide late last season for Melbourne in being kind of a slingshot player. I remember his importance particularly in their round 22 comeback against Carlton. Oh yeah, Carlton. Yeah, they were fun.
They're still catching strays. It's going to take a lot for them to not catch strays.
I think Callum Jamieson can grow into being a really important player. At just 22, I'm already liking some of the sides that I'm seeing from him. And then also, you do have Campbell Chesser and Oscar Allen in the mix for this year, and they weren't last year. Chesser going to make his AFL debut potentially round 1. We saw him in preseason action. And Allen will definitely be a breath of fresh air at the key forward spots and maybe some ruck moonlighting now that Josh Kennedy has retired. He's going to be taking up a really important spot really quickly. And I think you could see him, if he stays healthy, being pretty high in the Coleman race just because he's going to be such a common target.
If I had to pick a team for the wooden spoon, this would be the one. Although I'd say that with some level of hesitation. I don't see them being like obviously that much worse than perhaps North, maybe Hawthorn, maybe St. Kilda. But I think if I had to pick, this would be the one. But at the same time, I'm going to admit, I don't know a ton about this team compared to the rest of the league.
And compared to me.
Yeah. And let's consider, for example, you watched a lot of Geelong last year because they had a lot of primetime games and they were really good. I did not watch much of the Eagles because they didn't have a lot of primetime games. And when I did have a chance to watch them, they were usually getting their asses kicked.
I know, you said during our premiere for our wish list, you want the Eagles to give you reason to watch the second half.
Yeah, so maybe I just don't know much about them, and maybe there's more skill and talent there than meets the uninformed eye, because compared to the other 17 teams, this is probably the team that I enter the season knowing the least about, which is funny, because when we first started watching footy, watching these guys, it was an event, because you got to watch Nathan and Ryan do crazy shit.
Yeah, that first season when they lost in a 1-point elimination final to Collingwood, the Premiership core was still largely healthy, and a lot of them were still close to the skill level that they had 2 years prior. Also worth mentioning, of course, that Dom Sheed is looking to be back in action at a much higher level of fitness compared to last year when he hardly saw the oval. So, a whole bunch of players who didn't really figure in much last year, who will have more sizable roles this year. I still see them as a bottom third team. I might not see a bottom three. I can see them in the 13th through 15th range. And certainly their schedule is favorable for that because they've got double-ups with Adelaide, Carlton, Essendon, Freo, of course, North, and Richmond. So only one top 6 team from last year and only 2 finalists.
Yeah, this is about as friendly as it gets schedule-wise. And, I mean, other than, I guess, North, maybe?
North and maybe Essendon by some metrics, if you're looking at percent.
Well, North is the only team that only faces 1 finalist for last year twice. 7 teams face 2 finalists twice. So I would say if you had to pick the easiest schedule, it would be North. But the Eagles are not far off. A lot of that really depends on your perception of, I think, Adelaide and Carlton. And I guess when you get over to previewing North, your perception of Gold Coast, because as you probably know, we have a pretty poor perception of St. Kilda. If everything hits for the Eagles this year, how many games do you see them possibly winning?
I mean, if I see them, maxing out around 13th in a 23-game schedule, I could see them getting to 7-8 wins. But
that does seem like a best-case scenario in which, they're winning close games and things like that.
Looking at their schedule, just for a particularly tough stretch, rounds 3 through 8 are something to look at. You got the Freo-hosted Western Derby, hosting Melbourne, 2 straight weeks in South Australia because in the Gather Round they play Geelong and then Port in round 6. Then they got the Blues at home before going back to Victoria to face Richmond.
And frankly, even round 9, depending on how you feel about the Suns, and I'm relatively high on them.
I'm pretty bullish on them as well.
It would be cool to see the Suns win in Perth against an actual Eagles team instead of like a third of them.
Yeah, that 30-point win to open last year against whatever that skeleton crew was, and that wasn't even the worst of the skeleton crew.
There aren't any other Murderers Row stretches, although I'd say round 17 through 19, at Brisbane, home against Richmond, at Carlton is not great, and then the home leg of the Western Derby, round 22, and at the Bulldogs, round 23, not optimal, but if you could get somehow through round 8 at 3 and 5, I'd call that a success. If you get through it at 2 and 6 even, I'd say, all right, fine.
I mean, I think those 2 wins would probably have to come in the first 2 games then.
They've got to win one of the first 2 games, considering what the schedule looks like after that. No disrespect to North and GWS, but it's not the same level of competition they're going to be facing. If you lose both of those, you could be looking at 0-8, 0-9.
And by that point, does Adam Simpson's head come up to the chopping block?
Well, over these couple of years, coaching changes have not made sense to us compared to when the axe falls in American sports. So I'm not even going to begin to try to guess on those.
And honestly, I'm thinking that because he's a premiership coach, it'll probably end up being his call, even though at some point the upper brass of the club should end up having a say. My sleeper, by the way, since we hadn't gotten to it, it's hard for me to wrap my head around this guy being a sleeper, but when he isn't regularly talked about as being in the best 23, yeah, Brady Hoff is a bit of a sleeper. He's the younger Eagle that I enjoyed watching the most last year. Started off at halfback, worked his way more toward kind of a more outside mid and wing role as the year went on. And I noted a lot that he had some pretty frequent score starting ball use. If you're looking at, score involvements that are coming from players in the back half, Hoff tended to rank pretty high. And he goes along with that theme of young West Australian talent, and he's just 20. And so hopefully he gets into that best 23 early on and really stays there, because I think he could be a stable presence there for a really long time. If you have Hoff and Jones together in that halfback and wing spot, you'll have good movement. Jones's defensive abilities I still question. I'm more solid about Hoff in that regard. Oh yeah, Tom Barras deserved to be an All-Australian.
He was awesome last year. He was really the only defender that you look at and would have said, yeah, he would start on any team.
From, the very bottom teams, him and Sam Taylor, who was an All-Australian.
The Eagles have just one alternate site game this year, that being round 10 in Launceston when they take on the Hawks. And of course, as is tradition, they do not get to play the Lions at home.
They still have not in the history of Optus Stadium. 6 years. There is a conspiracy at the AFL house.
As Benjamin spins the wheel, and I also want to mention that beating this South Korea team, this is a good team. Like, for those couple weeks of watching the KBO when it was the best baseball on a couple of years ago,
with the great song for ESPN broadcaster Karavici.
Like, the guys who were batting 8th and 9th in that Korean lineup are legitimately good hitters who would be solid major league players, and that Australia held them off is pretty legit.
Too bad Koo Dae-sung isn't playing anymore. He was pretty good. Next up, from one kind of West to another, a lot of people think the Bulldogs could rise into a top 4 spot this year, despite having lost a key part of their midfield in Josh Dunkley. Maybe are people thinking it's going to be, a bit less crowded there, and so some players will have more of a chance to shine in a more natural role. Perhaps we'll see more midfield time again for Marcus Bontempelli, who spent a lot of time at full forward last year. We saw a new look at full forward for sure in preseason action for the Dogs, with a mix of 4 players being used to key forward, and all of whom really make sense in that spot. Aaron Naughton, Jamara Ugle-Hagan, Sam Darcy, and the newly acquired Rory Lobb. I'm not sure if people thought about this team as having the riches they did at forward, but it's very visible now, especially with how Darcy came along in his few games at the end of the year, and how Jamara really blossomed, especially with that 5-goal performance he put on against the D's at Marvel. That was his arrival game for sure.
I would love to know why anyone thinks this could be a top 4 team when they haven't been a top 4 team since there were only 16 teams in the league. Like, you just look at their form, and
it's not what they do. Luke Beveridge has never coached a top 4 team. He's coached 2 grand finalists and a premiership team, but no top 4 team.
And look, I think the Bulldogs do still have a lot of talent, even after losing Dunkley, but I don't see anything that tells me that they're going to be top 4. I think they could be...
You think they could be maybe around 5 or 6 again?
I think that's possible.
I mean, one thing that definitely helps is the return of Liam Jones, because he was such a valuable intercept defender, perhaps the best in the league if you look at 2020 and 21 before taking last year off. He's back where he started his career, and doesn't look like he's lost a step at all. And last year, I was really questioning their fullback ranks and really who would be the guy to take on a lot of those bigger targets one-on-one, because I wasn't seeing enough out of Alex Keith or Ryan Tika Masala Gardner.
And that's former cricketer Alex Keith to you.
Yes, of course. And also, we won't be seeing Gardner at the start of the season anyway.
He's got an elbow injury. It looks like this team is a pretty lengthy injury list. Benjamin, why don't you clue us into that a bit more?
So Gardner, along with Rourke Smith, who has a foot injury, have been ruled out for round 1, but we don't know their timeline beyond that. Smith was one of the depth contributors that we did notice a couple times last year, and we've talked so much about this list being top-heavy and really reliant on contributions from the known names. A whole bunch of players are questionable or their status hasn't been confirmed yet. There's Dominic Bedendo with a leg injury. Jed Busslinger has a shoulder problem. Tim O'Brien has a hamstring injury. Those 3 are unlikely. And then seems like Cody Waitman is more toward likely than questionable at this point. Still don't know about Jason Johannesson and his calf. Although admittedly, I think he's on the back end of things at this point and not sure if he'd be cracking the 23 anymore. They suffered 3 injuries to their potential best 23. I'd say 2 definitely of their best 23 against North in their second preseason outing. Taylor DeRay had a neck injury, left that game with a brace on. Ed Richards, who we liked a lot of last year, injured his quad, and then Hayden Crozier dislocated his finger. Richards was a guy who I thought felt a little bit out of place taking on some of the biggest key targets last year. So that's where I think Jones and his experience could really help in that regard. Maybe he could be a bit of a mentor back there. But the biggest injury, and the one that isn't, just a round 1 question, is Latham Vandermeer. Broken foot is taking him out for 2 months. So we don't really know what their round 1 list is going to look like, and maybe the rest of this month of March as well.
And it's going to be a pretty tough month schedule-wise.
Getting into April, certainly so.
5 of their first 6 games are really tough. The other is St. Kilda, but you open with the D's. Then after you get the Saints, you host the Lions. Cool. You have the Tigers at the G. Then you're at Port Adelaide during the Gather Round. You're at Freo. And then finally things cool off a little bit with the Hawks and then playing the Giants in Canberra. The other really tough stretch of schedule, I think, around 16 to 18 coming out of the bye.
I was going to say, that's nasty, even though those first 2 are in Victoria, hosting Freo and Collingwood. But then you got to go to Sydney to play the Swans.
The thing with this team, where we've talked again and again about the lack of depth, to the point where you can remember specific good games from depth contributors last year.
Rourke Smith, round 23, is one that I was thinking of, which is why I mentioned him in that spot. And then my sleeper had one as well.
Against Hawthorn. Hint, hint.
Yeah, both of them were actually against Hawthorn.
And Riley Garcia had that one good game against Melbourne.
Yeah, along with Jamara. I mean, those were the 2 guys that really got them over the line, and that one in another fabulous game in probably the best single round of a home and away season that we have seen in our 3 years watching the footy. People ought to be talking about that round decades from now.
The thing is, when you look at Geelong and what they did last season, and you look at having depth contributors like Jed Buse, Jake Kolajashny, having Zach Guthrie go from a minus to a positive,
everybody really having a real niche that into which they fit in that lineup, and a coach who knew where to move pieces around when necessary.
And it's not just having a niche, it's just having 6 or 7 good defenders, 6 or 7 good forwards instead of 2 or 3 amazing ones. You got to have...
I mean, I could see the Bulldogs having, the forward and midfield depth that's required, but once you get into the back half, it's much shakier.
And on the topic of injuries, what happens when someone gets hurt? I don't see a lot of great next man up options unless you count Buku Kamas as part of that group.
I think he's going to end up being a factor as a sub because he can fit into multiple spots. And I mean, who knows how functional Josh Bruce is going to be back in defense, which just seems like a weird move given what we saw out of him at his best a couple years back and also his ACL injury.
Yeah, I thought it would have made more sense, if you're going to move someone, wouldn't Aaron Naughton have made more sense?
I mean, Naughton will probably do some moonlighting as a center half back this year with the rotation of key forwards that they'll have. They'll probably have Naughton and Sam Darcy both slide back there when needed. And Sam Darcy, I know, is your pick for the Rising Star.
Yeah, it seems like a relatively safe pick rather than someone who was just drafted this past year.
Hint, hint, my pick.
And he looked fully ready late last season when he got on board. He's a sort of guy, though, that they're going to be relying on him a lot. And that's a lot to ask of such a young and inexperienced player at this level. I mean, he certainly has a sky-high ceiling, but they're going to be asking a lot of him right away.
A whole lot of options for sleepers for the Bulldogs, given what we said about their strength at the top of the list. And they had a few guys who debuted last year who I could definitely see as falling among that sleeper rank, and I believe yours debuted last year as well.
Yeah, and I picked him because you took mine, so why don't you go first?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I went with a father-son pick, Riley West. He had a 3-goal game against Hawthorn last year in round 15. That game was in Melbourne, and he was everywhere in the forward 2/3. I think he's going to have a more significant role now that Josh Dunkley has left. He honestly ought to be a known commodity, and I think he would in a lot of other lists, but I'm not sure if he is, given who's in front of him in the midfield ranks of the Bulldogs between Marcus Bontempelli, Bailey Smith when he isn't doing coke, Jack McRae, who was one of the most sound users of the ball in the entire league. He wasn't in the preseason game against North until Ed Richards exited, though, but I got to think he's in the best 23 at this point. And I hope so, because I'm of the opinion that he deserves that spot.
I remember liking him kind of linking between the midfield and forward groups.
You know, that's definitely part of Josh Dunkley's skill set as well. So that's where I think he can really fill in.
In my pick, just kind of by default, because I didn't see too many others I liked, even though he played in all of 2 games, was Dominic Bedendo.
And you have already pronounced his name better than Brian Taylor ever did.
He played in losses against the Lions and Swans, both on the road, kicked 1 goal. Remember that Lions game? They just got absolutely shitted on. And that is the proper verb tense, by the way. But,
yeah, that was back in round 16. That was a 41-point contest that was just a Lions breakaway in the second half.
He seems like the sort of guy who, he was a late round draft pick. He could be the sort of depth contributor they need. You're not asking him to be a superstar. You're just asking him be a quality player that we can put in the lineup regularly, and I think he's got the capabilities to do that.
So, Ethan, what are you thinking about the Bulldogs double-ups? Because based on, the metrics that I've used to judge them, dividing the teams into top, middle, and bottom 6 finalists, and then points and percentage, it could be a pretty mixed bag between particularly tough and going toward middle of the pack.
Well, they finished 8th on the ladder, and if you averaged out their schedule, I would probably say it's like the 6th or 7th toughest. If you assign points based on their finish on the ladder after finals, it would be the 9th toughest. If you go by percentage, it's 2nd, and if you go by points, 5th. Those double-ups, by the way, Freo, Geelong, GWS, Hawthorn, Port Adelaide, Richmond. So I see 2 wooden spoon contenders and
4 finals contenders.
4 legit finals contenders, including 3 that made finals last year.
And at least 2 that I can really see as top 4. And, a couple tough trips in there as well.
This is not the toughest schedule. I think it's probably best that they get some of those tough games out of the way early before teams have really found a groove. But then again, considering the injuries they're dealing with, they're going to be, I would probably, if I was setting lines on each of their first 6 games right now, I would have them as the underdog in 5 of them. Now, I'm not saying they're going to go 1-5. They could clean up quite nicely here. And if they come out of the first 6 games at 3-3, I'll actually probably be decently optimistic about their futures.
Yeah, that's definitely, as you said, rounds 3 through 6 are the toughest 4-round bunch they have.
Don't lose to the Saints. They really can't afford that with the way the rest of the schedule stacks up early on.
Okay, and how much will they lose to the Saints by?
A lot would have to go wrong to lose to them, I really think. But, early season games are weird, like we've said. Saints did start pretty well last year. So
Anything's possible.
it's just the more I look at that early schedule and their injury situation, the more I think this could be a team that could be in serious danger of missing finals entirely.
I do trend more toward them missing finals than I do seeing them as a top 4 team, but them being up for elimination in week 1 finals makes a lot more sense to me than either of those other outcomes. Because, again, it's what the Bulldogs do. The Bulldogs have a bunch of alternate sites this year. You'll be able to see them in a whole lot of different venues. Obviously, they have their games at Ballarat, their pair of games there. They've got the Crows again, round 10, a chance for redemption from the high wind 1-point loss last year that for a while looked like it was going to keep them out of finals until Carlton kept themselves out of finals. And then they go back there in round 20 to face the Giants. Both the Bulldogs' meetings against the Giants this year are at alternate sites because they go to Manuka Oval in round 8. The week after that first game they have in the Central Highlands, they go to Darwin to play the Suns in round 11, and the Suns showed out there last year in both their games there. So watch out for that one I don't think it's even a trap game anymore with how highly we think of the Suns.
There's always a chance the Suns lull you back into a false sense of security where there are a couple games where they just don't play defense.
Fair enough. And the Bulldogs also go to Launceston round 22, like they did in round 23 last year. It'll be Hawthorn's final game out in Tasmania for the season. One more team before we have our break, and we're going to a team that is in full rebuild mode now.
That could be a couple of them, so why don't you just tell me who that team is?
This is Hawthorn.
All right.
I assume you thought the other could have been maybe the Giants. Reasonable, but we've been talking so much about liking that the Hawks have bought into things as much as they have. And obviously changes at the top this offseason. A new president in Andy Gowers in the playing group, new captain in James Sicily, and they've jettisoned nearly all of their older pieces aside from Luke Brust and Chad Wingard. Brust is the only current age 30-plus player on the list, and he'll be joined by Wingard later in the year.
As I've said before, I won't get into it in tremendous detail because I've talked about it pretty extensively. They looked at their situation and decided, you know what, instead of just being, a fringe finals team that could maybe sneak in as 8th, let's pull back for a bit, really gear up with this core, and then go after actually winning a flag or even multiple flags a couple more years down the road, which is tough to have the awareness to do after having, I thought, a pretty encouraging season when you consider everything. And I really enjoyed the way Sam Mitchell coached, but I think ultimately this is the right move.
As do I. If you looked at the older players on the list who are still contributing, they got trade returns for them while they still could, while they still had a few more years of service to give. Tom Mitchell being traded off to Collingwood as part of a 3-team deal that involved the Cats. Jack Gunston going to the Brisbane Lions. And they're just really going to give the younger pieces a real go at things. They extended Ned Reeves, who we both think is going to be a really central figure for years to come on this list. Between what we've seen from him in ruck and half-forward work, that tall half-forward role for him looked like it could be the right spot going forward. And if he does really fit in there, that'll allow for a clearer ruck hierarchy. And they got some help there, too, for a player that you really took a liking to last year in particular.
Yeah, mostly because he gave the Cats a lot of trouble, that being Lloyd Meek.
You knew Meek was going to get squeezed out at Freo. I saw it coming as soon as Luke Jackson said he wanted to come home.
I thought there were other spots that might have made more sense for him in terms of really putting him at the top of the list as the number one guy, but this is a spot where he should be, I would hope at least, in the lineup regularly. Although I'm certainly not looking forward to facing him. As I said, in like goals for each team this season, I just want to see the Cats really clean up against them on Easter Monday because they've struggled with them the last couple years. I'd like to just put the hurt on them pretty convincingly.
You haven't really learned to dislike Hawthorn yet, have you?
No, because I haven't seen them that good. I didn't like losing to them, certainly.
I mean, who does?
But I've enjoyed watching them over this past year, and watching Sam Mitchell coach, I felt smarter after each game he coached because I felt like I learned something about one of his players or his tactics. So even though I don't expect them to be very good this year, which is at this point kind of by design, I'm interested in watching more of them.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of different younger pieces that we're interested in watching. Among the more established younger players, Jai Newcomb is clearly the central figure in the midfield now, and he was handed a contract extension. And looking in the back third, we have both sung Chankwath Jath's praises. And what he and the coaching staff really need to figure out is how to manage his time, because he would start off games so strongly and then his impact would diminish in the second half, and you'd really see that effect on the team as a whole. You know, you can think back to the Anzac Sunday game last year against the Swans as just one example of that.
There were a lot of games where they started super hot and then just kind of ran out of steam.
Just seems like the sign of a young, energetic team and one that's favorable to running at high speeds like they are. If you're looking at a couple of new acquisitions to watch, Cam McKenzie, the number 7 pick in the draft, looked strong, very mature against Collingwood in their last preseason hit out, and he's probably in for round 1. And then Fergus Green interests me as well, and not just for his name, because he shares a name with one of Shrek's kids. No Farkles or Felicias in the AFL list, sadly, but Fergus Green has been with Box Hill these past 2 years, the Hawks VFL affiliate. He had been with the Dogs before that. His 450 abilities are probably going to give him a best 23 spot for the year. And I think he's going to be really important in these first couple games because the Hawks will be without someone who, honestly, I could see as a Coleman contender otherwise.
Yeah, Mitch Lewis. I actually was trying to think of like a sneaky pick for the Coleman, but if he's going to be missing the first couple rounds, at least with an injury, probably really hurts his chances. But I feel like this is the sort of team where you can have one guy bag 4 or 5 goals pretty regularly, and perhaps considering where they would be as a team, likely towards the bottom of the ladder, then they get to the point where they're just trying to funnel a few more shots to that one guy. Although, I don't know if Sam Mitchell would necessarily go down that path, but maybe the players would, want to support one of their guys, get him that medal. So, that's just, I like the way Lewis plays. I like their forward group in general. In terms of set shot kicking, I see guys there that you can generally count on to handle business from a reasonable distance. I don't know if they have a ton of wow factor or guys who can score a lot from open play, but I see guys who can convert their set shots for sure.
Lewis definitely has showcased that open play ability. Who do you end up going with for your Coleman pick?
I was thinking about a couple of different guys. I know you had gone Jeremy Cameron. I thought about him. I guess I'll go Peter Wright.
Another player on what we think will be, a bottom third team that ought to get a lot of shots. So I think that's a pretty sensible pick there. Also worth noting on the injury front for Hawthorn that Harry Morrison has a bit of a hamstring concern, but as of the time of recording, he seems likely to play round 1.
Who's your pick for a guy to watch on this team, though?
I liked Lockie Bramble last year, and I want to see more of him here in 2023, but I'm surprised to not see him further entrenched in best 23 talks because he's another one of those guys that I noticed for starting play really well from the back third. And you've got some decent interceptors back there. Obviously, Captain James Sicily will lead the way in that regard, but I liked Bramble's ground level work as well. And also, for sleepers, I just like looking at players on the fringe of selection, and he's certainly that. And I think your sleeper is in a similar boat, looking a bit further up the ground.
Although I think with that Lewis injury, Sam Butler's odds of being in the lineup more are better, but he seems to be a guy who could end up considering that he's only 20, being a major goal scorer for this team for a really long time.
We'll see how much he plays like his brother Dan. It'll be interesting to draw the comparisons between the two of them as Sam's career emerges. You've got a couple siblings of AFL listed players on this Hawthorn team now, because you've also got Caleb Sarong's brother Jai, who we also liked in his time last year.
Bramble is a pretty solid pick, though, all things considered.
Thank you.
I think he's like the exact type of guy that we're looking for when doing this, which I hope you guys can start to understand. You guys being the listeners start to understand the sort of stuff that we're looking for when we're doing these. I kind of think back to how Jai Newcomb came out of nowhere last year.
I could start seeing it in 2021, but we weren't watching Hawthorn that closely then.
Where I'm thinking of like guys who are doing that sort of stuff that could become major impact players. I know the other one that we've talked about a lot is, finding like that next Nathan O'Driscoll.
Also, I'm just hoping that Grindmire's friend James Warble can have a more consistent year.
I just played Warble. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's the Footy version of Wordle, which seems to have been updated with this year's rosters and jersey numbers. I think I'm going to give that one last check here. Let me make sure that's all updated. Yeah, it is. Awesome. Good. Appreciate the people who started this game. Try to find here real quick. It doesn't seem to have the creator readily available on the website, but
props to them.
I'm glad that whoever did it has stuck with it. So, yeah, appreciate that.
Obviously, the Hawks have a few alternate site games this year because they've got their games at Utah Stadium. They have 4 on the docket for this year, their normal amount. And it starts pretty early. Round 3, they've got a Tasmanian tussle against the Hobart Tenants in North. They also host Adelaide for Anzac Sunday, as we mentioned last time, in round 6. They host the Eagles round 10 and the Bulldogs round 22, another Bulldogs trip to Launceston there. Strange that they're kind of front-loaded this year when I usually see them more in the back half of the season.
Maybe there's been some complaints about Tasmania weather there. Other interesting sight is in the Gather Round when they're playing at Norwood Oval.
Classic Sandful venue. They got the Giants there. That's one of 2 games at Norwood in the
Gather Round. Norwood Oval, by the way, has a capacity of 15,000 currently. Record attendance there is just a touch over 20,000. And it looks like they've also played some baseball there.
I think that was the former home of the team that's now, again, the Adelaide Giants.
I think the Adelaide Bite is a hysterical name.
It's a very minor league sounding name. We actually know a guy that did some ABL broadcasting.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, it seems like Aaron Whitefield, who is one of the few recognizable names on the Australian WBC team, has played for them.
Double ups this year for Hawthorn?
Not Geelong, which is still just strange.
For the second year in a row, not Geelong. But they've got Freo, Greater Western Sydney, Melbourne, North, St Kilda, and the Bulldogs.
3 finalists, 3 non-finalists. Of course, you got to have the 2 games against North, 1 in Tasmania. It's all right. This is about, between the 10th and 13th toughest schedule, depending on what metric you grade it out on. Although, I think of those 3 non-finalist teams, considering how far we believe the Saints are going to fall, that this is actually kind of I don't even know the way to describe it, like a polarized schedule where there are 3 teams that they see twice that could be really fucking good and 3 that just
could be really fucking bad. Like a sort of bimodal, I guess, if you're looking at the distribution. But it's there could be a lot at the top and a lot at the bottom instead of kind of more evenly distributed or a bell curve. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah.
And I'm not usually a math guy.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of a bell curve. But the 3 teams that we look at that they double up against the look like finals teams need to clean up against them, especially the Bulldogs, considering what we had just said about their schedule.
We're going to be taking a short break to help pay the bills, as little as it currently helps pay the bills, but you can change that with your support. So stick around, and we'll be back with 3 more teams to preview on the other side.
hey, if you're listening to this, you're probably a man aged 18 to 35, so obviously you want to make a podcast. A podcast? Well, that's a dumb idea, but sure, why not? How do I start? Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your phone or your computer. No fancy software needed. It's so easy you get edited while drunk. Anchor allows you to distribute your podcast on platforms like Apple, Spotify, and more, just like we do. Best of all, it's completely free. Not only is it free, you can even make money from listener support or ad revenue. Download the Anchor app. That's ANCHOR like on a boat, or on the Fremantle logo, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Plus, it's a .fm domain, so you're also helping out the good people of the Federated States of Micronesia. I would imagine if you're listening to this, you also listened to our first preview of this 3-part series, which would mean you probably already know where to find us. But in case this is your first time, let's just throw it out there again. We are on Twitter collectively at Americans Footy. I am on Twitter at Castle Media with a K. I'm on Twitter at BenjaminHK01. Ethan's cat, Brian Harambe, our third host and mascot all in one, is on Instagram, a cat named Brian. We're also on YouTube at Americans Footy. We should start posting YouTube shorts. I'm very morally opposed to TikTok because not even just the Chinese surveillance stuff, but just that it's a bitch version of Vine. But I think we should do TikTok style videos where we don't even do anything. We just point at something and nod. Just point at Liam Ryan's 2019 mark of the year and nod. Just point and nod. Right on. I'll get on editing that. And I'll also get on spinning the wheel for our next team to break down. We're halfway through things now between this episode and last. So we're going to start the second half with a team that had a terrible second half last year. Ooh, I think I know who this is. Is this the team that accidentally uploaded audio of their own coaches talking when they burned some game footage to a Central League database and maybe could have given away some info on what they thought of certain players and matchups as a result? I guess that would be the one, although it sounds like nothing that significant was in there nonetheless. I just find it funny. It's like reverse Spygate. Or, you know what I preferred to Spygate was WikiLeaks. This was an old Wake Forest staffer who leaked their game plans, is that correct? College football scandal from, was this about a decade ago now? No, it was just from 2016, so not quite a full decade, but feels older. This was when Lamar Jackson was at Louisville then. A former Wake Forest staffer passed on game plan stuff to, Louisville. I thought it involved Virginia Tech. I gotta read more about this later, but now is not the time for that. Now is the time to talk about how I think the Saints are going to be terrible this year. I mean, they pretty much added nothing, and two of their best players that weren't showing many signs of age other than getting hurt more retired. It's a shame that Patty Ryder couldn't really go out on his terms, make it back for the end of the season. He's actually now signed on as a director of Indigenous player development at his original club, Essendon. So good to see him stay involved with the game. And then we obviously didn't see Dan Hanbury in his prime either, but we definitely gained some appreciation for him. And I went back and saw some of his footage with the Swans. And I can understand the kind of impact he had back in their 2012 flag team and through the first part of the 2010s with them. For all the things the Saints did wrong to end the season, they sent him off right. Duck. So we both think they're going to suck this year. We thought they were going to suck last year. At first we were wrong. Then we were pretty right. Then when I thought they were actually kind of good, it turned out, no, they actually do suck. And it's just, I was very rarely right about them. I'm going to do the tipping challenge this year on the AFL website, and we'll see if I can actually get a read on them, or if there's a team that, does that this year where I'm just wrong about them every week, one way or the other. Again, what we think really drove St. Kilda's success in the first part of the season was that Rowan Marshall and Patty Ryder were both healthy. And so you could split them between ruck and forward 50 to support Max King. That's absent this year for multiple reasons. I mean, Marshall is the ruckman for the first time in 4 years, and his support for the first part of the season is also gone. I mean, this injury list is just nasty. And even if it wasn't, I didn't think they'd be very good. Like,
Again, what did they do to help themselves?
I mean, they picked up Liam Stalker in the supplemental selection period, and Carlton fans seem to think he was amazing at first.
I mean, they brought in Zane Cordy after he'd been delisted by the Bulldogs, and I mean, he'll be important as a tall early on because look at who they're not going to have. I mean, we alluded to it already. Let's start with Max King being out for probably the first 6 rounds, if not more, after there was an accident at training where he fucked up his shoulder. I guess we can only have one King playing at a time in this league. I mean, it's not like a Mackay level thing, but damn, are Twins cursed in the AFL?
There's some sort of joke here about the Minnesota Twins and not winning playoff games, especially against the Yankees.
Okay, the difference is...
I can't put the pieces together right now, but
here's what the joke is. The Minnesota Twins have double the championships that St. Kilda do. Let's just go down the line with more of this injury haul. Jack Hayes has a fractured metatarsal and is out for 2 months. Just a shame to see that he can't get back right away after he injured his ACL early last year. Broke out with a 3-goal debut against Collingwood, and then 5 weeks later, ruptured his ACL. So who's the next man up? Not Matthew Allison. He has a fracture in his foot. He's out for 5 months. Then you got Jack Billings with a 2-month timeline for a leg injury. Pick number 35, Ollie Houghton is out till the mid-season with a back problem. We know that Zach Jones has been ruled out round 1 with an Achilles injury. I'm not sure how much more time he has left with how fragile he is at this point, and that's disappointing. Because I liked both Zach Jones and his now retired brother Nathan from the D's. And then 2 of the players that impressed us the most last year for the Saints, week in and week out, especially toward the end of the season, are questionable for round 1.
Those being Tim Membry with a knee injury and Marcus Windhager, who broke one of his metacarpals. My thing with Membry, though, he seemed to be a goal assist machine and just play really well off of the guys around him, and I think there's less for him to play around.
I mean, with King out, he's going to need to be a more central target to begin with, between King and not having the Ryder and Marshall duo splitting time at forward, and he's already 28.
As much as I'm mainly going to be down on the Saints, I will say there are some pieces here that could be the part of a young foundation if the club knows how to actually build them up and add the supporting pieces needed, not just Windhager, but Mitch Owens.
Owens has gotten more and more aggressive in the air over the summer, and I really like that part of his game because his ground game was already established. He plays a little bit bigger than he is as well. He's willing to take on bigger defenders, and I mean, he is 6'3", 191 centimeters, but he plays a bit bigger than his size, and that's going to be important with Max King out. And then also, their first pick this year, Matthias Filippo, has had a very good summer as well.
And you're still waiting for Naziah Wanganeen-Miller to hit his stride, so look, there are some guys here that could be the part of a promising future, but
are they in it for, waiting for those guys to build up? I don't think this is what Ross Lyon signed on for when he came back. And also, did they really think they were in the position to contend now?
There's just a lot of big picture stuff with this club that I don't understand, where if we were looking at Richmond with these young pieces, we'd be super high on them
because of their track record of development.
Exactly. Or if Hawthorn had some of these young pieces, it would be like, all right, in a couple years, these guys are going to be really fucking good. Instead, just sit here looking at it like, I'm just not impressed. I think this team's going to be really bad. That said, the young talent could help them win a couple more games than I had expected. Maybe they get to 7, 8 wins. Best case scenario would probably be if everything hits and everyone heals up from injuries and everyone stays healthy, you're looking at 12, 13 wins and kind of being at the same spot as last year when it's all said and done. Maybe if the chips fall right, slipping into that 8th spot, but I don't think that's likely.
I see them more likely at the spoon than I do at 8th.
Yeah, I think the more I look at it, the more I think they're probably not wooden spoon. I think they're more just going to be stuck around 15, which, considering where they are in their competitive cycle, that's a very bad place to be. They do have a couple of other pieces that I'm kind of interested in. Defensively, mostly older group. That's where I think Hunter Clark, who's only 23, could really settle in and impress. He was injured for most of last year, played just 8 games. So I'm looking for a bounce back campaign from him. And if their defense plays up to the level that they're actually a decently competitive unit, he's going to have a lot to do with that.
So Clark is your sleeper. Mine is someone who has yet to play an AFL game and actually has only been at the club for about a month at this point. And this is really because of the injury run they've had. It's Anthony Caminiti. I had my eye on him a bit before the preseason outing against Essendon, and I think he's probably less of a sleeper now because of how well he showed then. A very strong mark already, and again, with or without Max King's injury, actually, just tall forward depth is a necessity for the Saints, and at just 19, Caminiti has the potential to be a long-term solution for this group.
Without ripping on St. Kilda much more, when things do go south for them, I've started to notice in the last few years, there are some programs, some clubs, some organizations that just understand winning and some that don't. And unless they prove otherwise, I think they're one of those ones that they just don't get it. I don't want to compare them to something as directionless as the Colorado Rockies, but
I was trying to think of a good comparison earlier.
I mean, the Rockies are kind of like their own special zone of incompetence.
I mean, that's from ownership down is the difference.
But unless I really see the Saints do something special, I'm not going to believe it. But now that I've looked at their list a little closer, even with some injuries, I could see them at least being better than Wooden Spoon. But if they have really horrible Saints luck and all these injuries, it might be a pretty ugly year. And if it is, don't say we didn't warn you. That said, their schedule is decently friendly, only doubling up against 2 finalists and 1 top 6. Their schedule, depending on how you measure it, is somewhere between the 11th to 14th toughest, so a little bit lower than their placement on the ladder last year. They double up with Brisbane, Carlton, Gold Coast, Hawthorn, North, and Richmond. So I think it kind of averages out to be about where the numbers say, because even if Carlton and Gold Coast improve, you think Hawthorn slides back. I think it's a pretty middle-of-the-pack schedule, and I think doubling up with the Suns, I think those might be 2 of the most important games of Gold Coast's season that could determine if they can finally get that first finals bid.
Interesting to see St. Kilda doubling up against both of the Queensland teams, and they will be making 2 trips to Queensland. They don't have either of those at alternate sites. They've dropped their Cairns game, which is good for footy.
It's not good from a standpoint of I love chaos and love sports in bad weather, as long as I'm not personally attending them in said bad weather. Like watching, who was it a few years ago? I think it was NC State and Notre Dame. Yeah, it was in 2016. It was 10-3. It was awful. The field was like flooded. They were kind of like on the outskirts of a hurricane, and the start of the second half was delayed by lightning. See, that's football weather.
Yeah, it's not fun to watch, though.
I will say this, their schedule doesn't have any really awful stretch, although the first 7 weeks are difficult, with the exception of Essendon, depending on what version of the Sun shows up, could be pretty nasty. 7 of their first 8 games are within Victoria, the only exception being the Gather Round, which is against Collingwood. They then follow that up with Carlton and Port Adelaide.
I should note also that Collingwood game is really the only place that you'll be seeing St. Kilda in, a less usual site for a matchup. No alternate sites for them this year, which is a shame.
Especially as a team that doesn't get, amazing attendance numbers. I'm surprised they don't get sent out a little lower.
Yeah. Looking at the worst stretches for them, coming out of the bye, rounds 13 through 15, they go to the SCG to play the Swans, the road team against Richmond in Melbourne, and then they host the Lions. They had a couple good battles with them last year. They would have been better had they not suffered injuries during them. I think they ended up being down 2 rotations at one point in one of those.
The final 4 weeks of the season are pretty difficult as well. Carlton, Richmond, and Geelong, those are all at Marvel, and they are the home team for all those games, if that's of any significance.
Will Dimma still complain about having to play at Marvel?
Since they're not the home team, probably less so. And then round 24 at the GABA. So it's not an easy stretch. I think that would be the toughest part of their schedule altogether. But there's no 6-week gauntlet or whatever. So that's something on their side. Their most difficult games are generally broken up. All right, who's next? We got 2 more for this episode. I guess we've only had 1 finalist so far out of these 4. So I would imagine we're in for something a little bit better.
I mean, we're definitely in for something better. How about the Swans?
Ooh, all right.
The team that you dislike the most at this point?
Yeah, as I've said before, there's something about just the perception of the city of Sydney.
Is there a pretentiousness in there?
I don't think so. I think it's the city that Americans think of when they think of Australia. And the couple of losses to them with Tom Papley and then Buddy Stousen. I mean, the grand final made up for a lot of that, but...
Oh, yeah, that 2021 game against them, I believe that was in Sydney. I think it was a 2-point win.
2 or I think 4. Either way, it was bad. It was badly officiated, and it
was a 2-point loss, and I guess they had it coming from their luck against Brisbane and not getting calls to go against them there. But yeah, I mean, I can get why Papley is so aggravating.
He's a guy that if he's on your team, you love him. If you're going against him, you hate him.
It's that fun German term, Backpfeifengesicht, or however you pronounce it. A face badly in need of a fist. Not advocating violence, but if there were any Swans player that I would expect someone to get violent against, it would be Tom Papley.
Peter Laddams.
I think Laddams would run away before anybody got violent with him. I think he's too cowardly.
Yeah, Laddams likes to start shit and then not really...
He's
really finish it.
He's a track star.
I am not a Peter Laddams fan, in case you couldn't pick that up.
I mean, he's another one where it's fun to watch him when he's at his best. I remember him standing out in 2020 for Port Adelaide against Richmond, because that was, I think, the game that really brought us back into the sport more than any other. For me, at least, it was that game. But yeah, Laddams is just a pain in the ass, and he doesn't know when to quit. And we're going to be seeing some of Laddams right away, because we're not going to be seeing Tom Hickey for round 1. He's been ruled out, as well as Ryan Clark and Robbie Fox. Clark has a hamstring injury. For Fox and Hickey, it's their calves. And Robbie Fox was a real pleasant highlight last year. A mature rookie list player who came up in really big spots in the back third for him.
Look, this is a team that had a ton of success last year. Normally a team that loses in a championship has some major changes that need to be made, or at least some sort of glaring weakness, whereas they really didn't. They just got their asses kicked by a team playing their absolute best. I mean, the McCartans played pretty poorly in that game, and
I mean, Tom had turnovers that led to the first 2 goals of the second half, and I think those were what really ended the game.
And Buddy kind of didn't show up at all.
Yeah, he did not, but he's got another year in him. Let's see how far up the goal list he ends up getting. He's already passed Gary Ablett Sr.
But this team, honestly, isn't about him. It's about youth. This is a young, ultra-talented, dynamic, fun group with so many guys who could be Brownlow winners.
I mean, there are 2 that really stand out in Chad Warner and Errol Golden,
and who people are going fucking nuts over his preseason performance. I mean,
it is preseason, but it was against a somewhat complete Carlton midfield as in terms of what we're going to see from them round 1. And Golden was just very in control. He's one of those players that I can really see as a future captain for the Swans, never getting too high or low kind of guy, whereas Chad Warner might be a bit easier to upset a little bit. But both of them are going to have their decade plus, if they stay healthy, to really make the league theirs. We'll see how long the McCartan brothers stick around, particularly Patty, because he's a little older and he's got that concussion history. He did have 1 last year, but I was just glad to see him back on the oval. It's a great story that he was able to get back and be as important as he was. And if there's a concern over age in the back ranks, it would be more so of Dane Rampy, who I know you gained a lot of appreciation for.
He was that guy who won them a lot of tight games by making some big plays in the fourth quarter. This is a team that, for the most part, they've shown expertise in tight games. It seemed like most of their losses, they either just didn't show up or, got cleanly beat by a couple of goals. And there weren't many losses to speak of, obviously. I mean, they went...
other than the 9-point loss to Essendon, yeah. And that was just a freak game in so many respects back in round 16. And then they didn't lose again until Geelong handed them their asses and their entire lower bodies on a plate and said, fucking eat.
To borrow the term that I've heard in a college basketball podcast I've been listening to lately, they red-bottomed them.
Yeah, that would do it.
But you look at some of the games they won, whether it was against the D's or against the Tigers,
against the D's both times,
where they had guys that made winning plays. And there were times when even if they were down a couple goals, someone would make that play and you'd know, all right, they've got this. And I just don't think there's much that they need to change, even though my prediction for them is to lose in the grand final again this year.
You have them losing to
the Lions.
I have the Lions beating Melbourne, and I'll just say that now.
But unless the Swans establish some really bad long-term trends for, finals losses or something, I don't think there's going to be any need for any drastic changes anytime soon.
They do need a long-term key forward solution, and hopefully Logan McDonald can grow into that, because, it's impossible to replace Buddy, and Sam Reed's mop-up work might not be around for much longer either. Just a couple other injury concerns. We talked at length about Papley, but didn't mention that he has a rib injury. He could be ready, as could Joel Amartey if his hamstring heals up. Amartey's another one who I expect to get that tall forward time to see, if he can stick there long term. He's gotten ruck and key forward work in the past, but hasn't been able to get consistent time. Callum Mills is also likely to play. Looks like his finger will heal up in time.
Amartey and Reed are both great examples of the depth that this club has, whereas you look at the Bulldogs, where past their top 15 or so guys, it's pretty rough. You look at Melbourne, where they had, kind of a lot of interchangeable last year. Look at Wheater Brown. And the Swans, it was they had more guys that could jump in and get shit done. And that's one of the reasons I think this team is so good. I have really struggled to find, anybody that I could think of as a young sleeper for them. And this might be the hardest one, because just about everyone is kind of established at this point. I was a little early on the Nick Blakey train compared to most people last year. I was really high on James Rowbottom just making winning plays. Man,
he is just one of those just gutsy players off of ruck contests. So important in clearance work all over the ground. And he's another one of those younger pieces that makes me really think that this team could stick around for a while.
So who's your sleeper?
I got Hayden McLean, and I hadn't thought about him for most of last season until he showed up again in the grand final. Yeah, he hadn't played since round 8 before that. And, with the injury concerns to rucks to start the season, and, me not being sure about how Amartey fits into things, it could definitely provide him a pathway into the top 22 or 23. He kicked 2 goals versus Carlton in the preseason outing as well, so good signs from him going into the home and away campaign. I had considered Harry Cunningham for this sleeper spot, but Ryan Clark's injury brought Cunningham into greater focus as a potential round 1 inclusion. Who did you go for, Ethan?
I'm going for Angus Sheldrick, who played in round 1 and then was the unused injury sub in round 2, just because I think he's going to get some chances with a team looking for a little bit more at forward, kind of looking long term. This is a guy who was a first round pick. He is on the smaller side, only about 5'10", so not quite, the body type that you're looking for to replace Buddy, but I think this is a team that, because of how quick they are, can make things work with more small forwards and maybe just overwhelm teams with speed rather than worry about size. And then instead of looking to take contested marks, you just get guys in the open. Now, the one thing that I think will work against the Swans this season is that their schedule is an absolute bitch.
They have the toughest schedule in the league by multiple metrics.
I would say Geelong has the next toughest. I think this is the toughest schedule. Their double-ups are Fremantle, Geelong, Gold Coast, GWS, Melbourne, Richmond, whereas...
So those are 5 finals contenders, and who knows if the Giants will give them a competitive game, but holy cow.
I'd like to think the Giants will play with them at least once. I hope at least it looks more like the first Sydney Derby than the second, because the second was awful. But, yeah, this is not going to be easy. They do kind of open on a semi-comfortable note. Suns away, Hawks home, and then they really get into it. You've got at Melbourne, Port Adelaide at home, Richmond in the gather round, then at Geelong.
I am very glad that they've got Richmond and Geelong twice.
Then you've got the Sydney Derby, then at Collingwood, home against Freo, and then rounds 16 through 19, you've got a pretty nasty stretch of Geelong at home, at Richmond, Bulldogs at home, at Freo, and then they travel to Essendon round 20, but Essendon's played them tough in recent years. That's also where I think doubling up against Gold Coast isn't easy, because the Suns have played them really well for the last couple of seasons. This is not going to be an easy schedule.
I'll back them in to have a home final, so top 6, but I don't know where in that top 6 they'll be.
I think this is still one of the best teams in the competition, top to bottom. I will say rounds 20 to 23 can be pretty forgiving, starting with that Essendon game. Then they play at GWS, host the Suns, and then play at Adelaide. So even with 3 out of 4 on the road, that could be a more forgiving stretch, but they're going to be tested week in and week out. I'm sure we'll be talking about them a ton. I really look forward to seeing what they have in store this season. As much as I may enjoy them losing, I think it's going to be a fun team to watch, where I'm going to be able to get a lot more out of watching them this season than just, yeah, they're really good.
Only venue note for the Swans is that they do make the trip to Geelong this year. That's round 6. That's the Cats' first home game, so big ceremony in line for that one for obvious reasons. And I want to see Joel Selwood and Levi Ablett unveiling the flag.
Don't forget Selwood is also leading the march in from Federation Square next Friday.
Look, give the man everything he wants.
By the way, Selwood is now in an off-field role at Geelong to go along with the stuff he's out with the Melbourne Storm. He's going to be doing some things outside of the day-to-day football program, working with partners, stakeholders, and members. So this might just be kind of like a casual thing while he's busy, having kids. But at least things like, maybe he's the guy that gets on a call with the, when it's like, hey, you want to renew your membership for next year? I'm Joel Selwood.
All right, is it going to be another finalist? Holy cow, it's not.
North?
It is North. So, one of the teams that played the Swans tough last year, believe it or not, that was all the way back in round 4, where the Swans had to solidify things late to come home by 11 points. That was one of North's highlights. There weren't many others.
Look, they're not going to be as bad as they were last year.
I still have them as the spoon.
I think the Eagles are more likely. I think
Hawthorn is more likely than the Eagles.
I think bringing in Griffin Logue and Darcy Tucker will help a bit.
I'm not sure where Tucker sits, if he's in the 23 right now. I think with the injury to Ben Mackay, he will certainly be more of a factor in the back. Oh yeah, Ben Mackay's hurt again. And what timing, considering we're a month out from North playing Carlton.
Harry Sheasel looks really fucking good already, and I'm super excited to watch more of him.
I hope he and Todd Goldstein both had a great Purim.
They also bring in Liam Shields.
That's, I think, just more of a leadership thing. I'm not sure how much more he has to offer in terms of playing. He was on the outs at Hawthorn to begin with, and this is him reunited with Clarkson. I wouldn't be shocked if that deal maybe involved a transition to coaching after a year or two, like we see with some players at the end of their playing days. But yeah, Ben Mackay has a bone stress issue in his right foot and is out for, quote, the early rounds. Watch him come back in round 5 after Good Friday. There is only one Mackay.
And they only play Carlton once. Their schedule is pretty friendly.
I mean, it's as friendly as it can be. They only double up against one finalist. I guess that's what happens when you take the spoon. It's Essendon, Gold Coast, Hawthorn, Melbourne, St Kilda, and West Coast. The possibility is there for, some upward mobility. I'm just not sure how much they'll be able to seize it. And we could really see those Hawthorn, St Kilda, and West Coast double-ups as factors in who ends up getting the chance to draft Harley Reid.
I don't think this team is going to be quite as bad, just with some of the guys that they've brought in.
I mean, I don't think they're going to be like a 50-something% team like they were last year.
I forget if it was Gary Lyon or David King. By the way, I think of all the main Fox Footy analysts, I typically agree with King the most, but there was discussion after they had played Melbourne at Marvel.
This was in round 10. This was the last of Melbourne's run of wins to begin the season,
where it was like, we're patting them on the back for competing for a half before getting blown out. And I think they're going to be more competitive this year. I think with some of the renewed energy that's going to be around them, with some of the change of faces, change of culture, change of voices, it's going to be a little bit better. This is still probably not that good of a team, but I think there's something there. Jai Simpkin, whose biceps look absolutely insane right now, could end up having some of the best possession numbers in the entire league, could be a monster in fantasy.
That's co-captain Jai Simpkin to you, along with Luke McDonald, who got the share of duties at Captain's Day today. Interesting to see which co-captains get the honors there. For Richmond, it was Toby Nankervis. For Brisbane, it was Lachie Neale over Harris Andrews. The Eagles didn't even send their captain or vice captain because Luke Shuey is still rehabbing. They sent Liam Duggan. Hope you had fun, Liam.
My concern with the Alistair Clarkson hire is the same as it was before. When you have a coach that's accustomed to success, do they have the patience and energy and attention to detail to do all the things that you need to do to build things from the ground up? And does some coaches want to take on that challenge, but for some, it's like you get so accustomed to success that it's hard to be shitty. And again, he hasn't worked a club from the bottom in 18 years. See, and that's where I like the situation Adam Kingsley is in at GWS. He's the only new first-time head coach of the AFL this season. The 3 other hires are all retreads. See, I think Adam Kingsley is the sort of guy who, when you're down by 40 in the final minutes of a game and a guy makes a good play to save a ball from going out of bounds on the full, he'll be there to pat you on the back and hype you up for that. Whereas I don't know if the other new coaching hires have that sort of energy and motivation. If they do, awesome. Then you've got guys who not only have that motivation, but have the proven record of success. But that's hard to guarantee.
The other thing that isn't helping North is that there are a number of players whose injury timelines are unclear. You mentioned Darcy Tucker as one of the new guys in. I was thinking maybe he'd have a shot to get in with questions in the back half, considering Mackay being out, but he's got a knee issue. And Cam Zurhar, who's probably their most exciting player game out, had a calf strain in the preseason, hit out against the Bulldogs. They're both unlikely. And then questions for a bunch of others for round 1. Aiden Core has a calf injury. So does Curtis Taylor. Aaron Hall is rehabbing something with his Achilles. They're all questionable. We do know that Callum Coleman-Jones has a partial plantar fascia tear, and so he will have a delayed start to the season. And we don't know what George Wardlaw's timeline is yet. The 4th pick this past November, he's had a hamstring problem throughout the summer, and I'm not sure when he's going to be up into full game form. But hopefully that just gives Clarkson and staff more of a green light to try out more players in different spots, like I've said with Hawthorn and like I hope for West Coast. And Coleman Jones was providing ruck support among other things, and that's a spot where I do like where they are with still having Todd Goldstein. Love that he's sticking things out the way he is, and hopefully Tristan Jerry can stay on the oval a bit more this year, because I like what I saw from him in the early going.
I know we talk a lot about ruckman stuff, but when they were able to operate with three of them, it made them at least, maybe not good, but a challenge to match up with.
Also, I just find the whole ruck carousel around the league fascinating. It reminds me of an ice hockey goalie carousel, and North have been stable the past bit with that, and so good for them on that front. Where does your sleeper lie for North? Because, they've got so much talent that I don't think a lot of people have really paid attention to yet.
Judging by what you had said, I'm surprised you described what they have as talent.
Potential. Potential's the better
I'm
way.
going with a guy who got in one game, was a great story, had one disposal, and then left injured.
Oh, Miller Bergman grew up a Kangaroos fan. That was tough to see.
Yes, his dad played for the club. I believe he is Miles Bergman's brother. Only found one thing saying it. This is a team with very little locked in defensively. Logue is listed as a defender. And Ben Mackay, when he's healthy, great.
When is he healthy?
Aaron Hall gains a lot of ground.
What else does he do?
Because he's bringing the ball out from after behinds.
He broke a record for meters gained last year, and it did absolutely fucking nothing. Again, there are functional meters gained, and then there are non-functional meters gained. He is the king of non-functional ground gaining.
Aiden Bonner, there's not a lot that makes me super excited. If I was a North fan, I wouldn't be like, hell yeah, Aiden Bonner's going to play. So Bergman has a chance just as a young guy and a fresh face, plus as a compelling story to be something there and maybe mean something to the fans in a club where there hasn't been a ton of that. Just seeing last year how much this fan base needs something to hold on to.
Look at how enraptured they were once Clarkson came on.
Ben Cunnington was their rallying cry last year and he hardly played. Just, to have a guy that is really North through and through for a team that doesn't usually have that identity. You don't have the photos of the players as little kids wearing North gear, I think.
No, you have a photo of a draftee wearing a North jumper to bed and then him asking for a trade home by the next year.
Yeah, so that's another area where Bergman could be really helpful. Who's yours?
I've got Quinn Perez, who had some time last year, was the sub on a couple occasions, fitting in a halfback midfield spot. I want to see how his role's really defined under Clarkson compared to how it was under whatever David Noble did and what Lee Adams has done as well. I'm glad that Patch is able to stay on with the club because I think he got him playing the right way near the end of things and was at least a good motivator. So Perez was drafted as a defender, but he got considerable midfield time last year. And look, they need a non-Ben Mackay and non-Griffin Logue answer in one-on-one defensive 50 matchups because I want to see Logue continuing in that role that he had at Frio where he's able to swing between the 50s on a somewhat regular basis. So if Perez is able to stick in the back six and really get time working with one-on-one matchups, I think there can be some good from him there. In terms of their schedule, nothing's going to come easy for North this year,
especially because they don't get to play against North.
Look, they were able to play against pretty much nobody in round 2 last year. That's not going to happen again. We think, fingers fucking crossed it doesn't happen in round 1 for the Eagles' sake more than anybody else.
It's totally possible that either North or West Coast are at the top of the ladder after round 1.
Just because they absolutely beat the other up.
Yeah, which would be really fun for that week of memes and shit posts on Instagram. So
we was top of the ladder.
As much as I want to see the Cats on top of the ladder, I would totally be okay with that.
North's toughest stretch of the schedule looks to be before the bye. They've got a rough run of things in 7 of 8 rounds between rounds 4 and 11. Round 4 is the Good Friday game against Carlton, where we likely won't see the Mackays matching up against each other because, again,
There is only one Mackay.
Whatever the Australian version of the CIA is, will probably come after us for exposing their secret.
It is a privilege to provide you with the truth.
Become ungovernable.
after that, they have quite the venue for the Gather Round against the Brisbane Lions.
Yes, this will be out at Mount Barker, Summit Oval. This in the Adelaide Hills, east of the city. It'll be the first and only game played there, at least for this season.
We'll see if they return there if the Gather Round returns to South Australia. And I imagine it will once it kind of runs through the other states. But they've got the Lions in Mount Barker. Then they go to Gold Coast. They're the technical road team against the D's round 7. St. Kilda should be a bit of a let-off round 8. I hope it is. I hope for North's sake that's competitive. From there, those next 3, though, hosting Port Adelaide and Sydney, and then technically away against Collingwood. So not a fun stretch there. And if you see their percentage dip down to those levels close to what it was last year, I mean, don't necessarily be surprised, but I don't think it's going to stay there the whole way this season. Now, I will note that Port Adelaide game is also another alternate site affair.
Yes, that'll be part of the Tasmania experience. That game is at Blundstone Arena. Also, round 3 against Hawthorn, the Tasmanian tussle. That'll be in Launceston. They'll also be at Blundstone to take on the Giants, round 13, the Demons in round 21, and the Suns in round 24. Getting used to that whole idea of round 24 it's going to take a while.
Yeah, but we're already used to a Tasmanian game in the final round. It's just been Hawthorn the past couple years.
And it's been, 23, not 24.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're going to stick at 23 rounds for long. I think they're going to go to 24 games soon. Just the odd number of games just doesn't sit right. Like I'm expecting the NFL to go to 18 soon.
But since you have that neutral game and the
Gather Round,
it does work. Here's a question. Since their schedule is a bit front-loaded, if you've got a team like North that you don't expect to be at the top of the ladder, would you rather their schedule be front-loaded and then in the back half of the season you kind of get to watch them play against lesser competition, although those games have lower stakes? Or would you rather have them, stay in the picture longer, but towards the end of the season in these, meaningful games that you might get hyped up for, they end up just kind of getting red-bottomed?
Red-bottomed and just like fading into the bottom third as a result?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to end up in the same place either way. It's just, I mean, would you rather get excited about them at the start of the season or at the end?
I'd want to say the end because I think the start of the season, at least you'd have realistic expectations. And then by the end of things, the coaching staff, the off-field department should at that point be able to figure out, okay, this is what's going to work going into next year. And the fans can be positive about that rather than just being demoralized by the beatdowns at the end of things.
The thing is, just from my perspective, it's like, if there's a game that we know isn't going to mean much, we're going to pay less attention to it. And I think most people would. So that's the challenge there.
So we're through 2/3 of the teams now in this 3-part home and away preview. I think things have been going at a pretty nice pace still. It's been good to kind of get more into these sleepers. And, it'll be interesting going back while I edit this, hearing how we talk about teams that we expect to be higher versus lower on the ladder.
I'm looking forward to really saving some of these predictions and our perceptions heading into the season, kind of see the expectation versus reality and trying to really chart that and map that out. Because I feel like if there was a bit of a blind spot we had last year, was not saving direct accounts of in this week we said this or we predicted this and then we were right or we were completely wrong. So that's something that I'm going to try to do more.
I think that's definitely going to help inform us when we hit August and September, when we do the post-mortems, whether it's, in the so you didn't crack the 8 or the breakdowns as teams bow out of finals. That'll be a good way for us to go back.
100%.
Essentially. But essentially now, we're going to get off this so that we can start moving toward part 3, which should be coming your way in a couple days' time. Again, you can find us on YouTube and Twitter at Americans Footy. I'm at BenjaminHK01 on Twitter.
I'm at Castle Media. Brian is sleeping on the bed next to me. He's on Instagram at Cat Named Brian. I just posted a video of him playing around on the stairs. It's really good. You should definitely watch it. And I'm not sure where we're going to be in terms of World Baseball Classic stuff at the time this episode is actually released. So I'm just going to throw out all of the things that are definitely going to happen. I can't believe Australia lost 20-0 to China, but then put up 30 runs against Japan and made Shohei Ohtani cry on the field.